All right, welcome to this track. Welcome to the session dedicated to building integrations with Creatio, methods, tools, best practices. My name is Kirill Krylov, and I will be guiding you through this lesson, through this interactive session. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in the chat. I'll try to get to all of them. I work for Creatio as a technical trainer. I've been with the company for over 3 years, and my past experience is in accounting and finance. All right, let's quickly go over the agenda. So on the agenda today is to review the available options that we have when talking about integration. We're going to talk about building a simple application, what we should be using, what kind of tools we should and should not be using. And then when everything is done, we're going to hopefully conclude with some recommendations, some concrete recommendations for you to integrate in the future. Okay, so let's discuss a couple of options that we have when it comes to integration with Creatio. So the first option that you see on the screen is data service. A data service is the endpoint that we as the company use to build our UI. So if you look at the browser tab and you look at the network in the console in Chrome or Edge or whatever the browser you use, you will see that there's going to be a lot of requests going back and forth, the select request, update request, delete request, etc. And those requests are all data service requests. Now, data service is the endpoint that is very powerful. It offers us option of querying data, creating new records, updating existing records, deleting records, doing batch transactions, and many other options. Now, there is also OData there. The purpose of having OData is to provide similar experience for building structured query, but in a much, much simpler way. So when you don't need all the bells and whistles that data service offers, you can just simply go and build things around OData. There's also a great many libraries out there that allow you, that help you with the OData integrations. Currently, Creatio supports 2 versions of OData, OData version 3 and OData version 4. And then there is a custom web service or custom configuration web service. Custom configuration web service is arguably just as powerful as data service, if not more powerful, and that's because you have a full flexibility of the entire .NET platform when you're calling this endpoint. Now, the problem with the custom configuration web service is that you have to actually build your own endpoint. You have to provide some code. You have to make sure that you do the routing correctly, that you query the data, that you anyway, there's a lot of things that you need to take care of. And when you want to query the data, you may not want to be building any applications. You don't want to be building your assemblies and things of that nature. So we're going to maybe talk about it at the end or towards the end. But for now, let's just concentrate our efforts on data service and OData. These are 2 services that are available to you out of the box. There's nothing you need to do. There's no extra installation. You don't need to install anything. You don't need to enable anything. You go to any system right now and you will be able to use these data services. And that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. So the advantages and disadvantages of data and OData, data service and OData is that OData is easy to use, easy to consume, but it's not as powerful as data service. Data service is very powerful, offers you things such as matrices, multilingual support, batching, etc. But it's a little tricky to work with. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to jump into a live demo. And let me get my screen going. Let me switch the screens. Perfect. So you should be seeing my Postman right now. And what I have here in Postman is I've created myself a workplace for how we're going to be executing web requests. So all the services that we're going to be first testing, we're going to be building them inside Postman, and then we're going to be moving them to some third-party system. So no matter what you're building, the first question that should be on your mind is how do you pass authentication? So how do you make sure that your application, that the third-party application that you're building is secure? Well, the answer is quite easy. You pass the authentication. You call into our authentication service first. You get a bunch of things or a bunch of cookies, and then you present those cookies with every following request, and the following requests are now authenticated. Now, that's true for pretty much everything except for one instance. There is one exception, and that's when you're writing your configuration web services. You can, if you really try, you can build unauthenticated web service. Now, you might be wondering why you would want to do that, and the answer is quite simple. Sometimes you're working with systems that want to talk to you, but they don't know how to pass our authentication. You have no control over them. For example, you might be working with a system that offers you some callbacks or some webhooks, as they're called on the internet. So if something wants to do a webhook with you, they're probably not going to know how to pass our authentication. They're going to have no idea what our cookies are. They're not going to know much about our system. So in that particular instance, you might be tempted to build your anonymous web service, and there is an article on the Academy how to actually do that. But you have to understand that you're opening up a security concern, and you have to handle your authentication on your own. Usually, when you get those requests, when you get those webhooks, there's going to be some sort of a token, and it's a little bit more advanced than we want to discuss in this particular topic. So let's talk about normal requests, the requests that you have full control, therefore you can pass authentication, you can get that cookie, and you can actually come back and make a real data request. So what I have for us here is I have Postman with a couple of environment variables. So I've created an environment in which I've provided few variables. So the first variable is the domain, the second one is username and user password, and Bpmcsrf. Now the username and user password should be self-explanatory, and the domain is where my application lives. Currently my application lives on this URL. Bpmcsrf is something that we need to capture in order to make a real request. So all I have to do is I have to go into my body and I have to send a post request, and in the post request to domain/service model auth login, we're sending username and password. If I were to send this right now, I'd get a code 0, and that's because my username and password match to what's in the system. If I were to make a mistake and I were to send something that does not exist, for example, something like this, I would get a message from the system back saying that invalid username and password, and you know the drill. So let's make sure that we are using correct username and password. And in this case, when you send the request, in return, you're getting 4 cookies: BPM loader, ASPX auth, username, and Bpmcsrf. Now this cookie you can just simply decode in ASCII, and then you're going to get your username. The auth cookie you just simply have to present from a cookie bag. So most of the browser and most of the .NET and any other system that you're using, they're going to be automatically handled for you, and BPM loader as well. But there is one special cookie that we have here, this Bpmcsrf, and that has to do with the security. And we secure our system in such a way that in order for you to execute the following post request, you actually have to capture the value of Bpmcsrf cookie and put it in the header of your following request. So in the following request, where you're going to be asking for real data, and be it OData or data service or configuration service, it doesn't matter, all of them have to have Bpmcsrf cookie in their headers. And so what I've done for myself here is I went into test and I said, let's declare a new variable inside Postman, and let's say, Postman, could you please get me a cookie from response? And I'm specifying that I am interested in Bpmcsrf cookie, and I'm grabbing the value of this cookie by name. And then what I'm doing is I'm just simply saying PM environment set, and I am setting the environment variable to that cookie. And you can see the environment variables in Postman right here, and here is the value of the cookie that I just obtained. So if we were to compare it, we should see that Bpmcsrf string here, it should match to what I see right here, and it seemed to be a match. Okay, great. So now that we've passed Bpmcsrf, and now that we've got all the cookies that we need, we can move on with the real thing, and we can start looking at the actual requests. So let's take a look at OData. OData is arguably a simpler endpoint, so let's review it first. So we support OData 3 and OData 4, and they're very similar in the way you structure your requests, and very similar in the way you are getting your responses back. And yet there are some differences. So let's start with an older one. Let's start with OData 3. Now, OData 3, in this particular example, what I'm trying to do or trying to get to is a list of contacts whose email matches a particular string. So you could see that I have my URL and it's a GET request. And for GET requests, you do not need to send Bpmcsrf cookie, even though I am passing it, even though I am providing, but you technically don't need to do it. It will work without it. Only for the post request, puts, deletes, and all that stuff, you need to actually send the Bpmcsrf. For everything else, you do not. Okay, so let's take a look at our parameters. In our parameters, my parameters, I have a couple of queries, so a question mark, and then everything in OData starts off as a $sign. So $sign select and then =sign for strings or for column names or properties of the object that I am trying to query. So in this case, I am query contact. Well, somebody made a mistake here, and it's actually contact collection that I'm trying to query. And I think this is an OData 4, so I apologize for that. So let's send this. This is OData 4 actually, so it doesn't take collection at the end. So let's do this, and you can see that I am getting a request here that allows me to query and to get some data back. So it's very simple endpoint to work with, and all I have to do is I have to enumerate the columns that I'm asking for. So here I'm asking for name, email, mobile phone, and account. I can also ask for address, for example, if there is one, but I don't think there is an address for this particular person, and so the address column comes back as empty. The other things that I can ask here are, for example, in the filter. So I can say that I am looking for somebody with an email whose value is k.krylov@creatio.com, or this is my email. I can change it to anything I want, and it's super easy because it's all part of your URL. So this is how easy it is to build OData. OData 3, OData 4, they follow very similar structure, and the syntax is pretty much the same. Now, in terms of the response, you could see that you're getting just a bunch of strings back, and all you have to do is you have to literally just parse this. Usually you would use some sort of a JSON parser, maybe Newtonsoft, or you would use, if on .NET, Microsoft new JSON parser from System Text, I believe. It doesn't matter, whichever way you do it, it will work for you, and you will be able to get the values. Now you have to know though which ones are IDs, so you can parse them as GUIDs, and which ones are integers and which ones are dates and times, and that might be a little bit daunting if you are not familiar with the data structure of our product. So let's now take a look at what data service offers us. So I'm going to close OData request, and let's save changes for good measure, and let's go to data service. So in data service, when I'm querying, and I'm first going to show you how to query it, and then we're going to talk about how we build a request. So when we query something in data service, you get two main nodes. The first node is going to be a row config node, and the second one is going to be a bunch of rows or an array of rows. In the row config, you get a data definition for every column that you have requested. So in this case, you could see that ID is a data value type 0. Now you might be wondering what is 0 and why is it easier? Well, it might not be easier for you to read it here, but if you use one of the Terrasoft libraries or classes, you would be able to get to the enum that tells you that the data value type of 0 is, for example, for GUID, and for data value type of 1, it's a string, and then the int has its own enum, etc., etc. So this is great because the row config now tells you what kind of data is coming back. So now you don't have to guess if it's a GUID, if it's a string, if it's a datetime, or if it's something else. You can refer to the row config row or row config property, find the property you're trying to parse, and then apply that parser, which is great. The next thing that you're going to get after you get through row config is a bunch of rows. In here, all I'm doing is I'm just simply requesting all the contacts in the system, and I believe there is about 60 of them, or maybe a little bit more. And you can see here's my ID, here's my name, here's the email, the mobile phone, account, photo, etc. So This data is coming back to me in this nice format, and all I have to do is I have to actually just find the one I'm looking for, or in this particular case, since I haven't restricted my query in any way, presumably I am actually interested in all the contacts in the system. Now, there is one thing that you need to understand is that you cannot just go and query the entire database. There will be a limit to how many records you can query out of the system at one time. Namely, 20,000 records is the limit usually set for all system by default. So if you're asking for more than 20,000 records, you're going to have to do it in batches. Where's the batching, you might ask? Well, let's go to the body of the request and let's take a look how the request is built. While the request is being built, the request that we're building consists of multiple options. There are some options related to the request itself that describes things like how many rows to return, how many rows to offset, and this is how you would do the batching, whether or not it's pageable, whether or not we should be using localization, and whether or not we should be using deactivated records. All these features we'll discuss in detail. Then, once you define the properties or the options for your request, you're going to be going into the columns and you're going to describe every single column how to get it. So for example, here we are creating a new property, ID, and we're saying that this is a property of a type expression and the expression type 0. That just simply means that it's an entity column, meaning that we're taking it from a database. It's not some sort of a calculated field or some other exotic property. It's something that we can just simply take from the database, and we are specifying column path to that particular property in reference to a contact. So what you could see here at the bottom, I am specifying account city name. So we are starting off from a contact, and think of your SQL where you would say select something from table contact. Well, if I want to select something related to a contact, for example, contact relates to an account, account has navigational property of city, and the city has a property name. So if I'm looking for contact.account.city.name, this is how I can express it. The contact is my starting point, and account city name is where I want to end up. If you were to do it in SQL, you would probably need to join a couple of tables together and then navigate your way down to the city name. In data service, it's very easy. If I wanted to add another column, all I would need to do is I would need to just take something like this and just duplicate it. And there you go, you have a new column. So the question now becomes is, how do I know how to build this? One might agree that this is not the easiest thing to build, and I have to agree, it's not. It looks a little bit daunting to build these type of requests, especially if you start getting into filters. So there is a trick that we can employ. Let's go in Creatio system, and looks like I need to log in. So let's log in. Supervisor, same credentials that we're logging in with data service. So when we're here, and I want to look at how I can build my contacts or how I can build requests to my contacts, where can I see some of those examples? Well, let's go to contact section, and before we do that, let's bring up console. So developer console, we press F12 and we get this thing. Let's now navigate to the contact section, and we see that there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of requests being sent back and forth, and I already have pre-configured filter. Let me turn it off now so that it matches to what we have in Postman. And let me click on the contact one more time, but before I do that, I don't want all this stuff, so I'm just going to clear it really quickly and click on the contact one more time. So now the only request that I am seeing in the network is the select query. Let me make it a little bit wider so we have a little more space to work with. Now let's review the endpoint that the UI is sending it to, and it happens to be exactly the same endpoint that I have shown you in Postman. So if you're building your own request, just take a look at the network tab, take a look at the select query, update query, delete query, and you will see where you need to send this request. You also will see that it's a post method and that response is 200. Great. Now let's go all the way down to where it says source. Now we can't really work with this. I mean, Chrome or Edge, they're trying to be nice and they're trying to parse it for us, and that's great, but I want to see the source because I need to modify it myself. So let me click on the view source, and then here is the entire source of my request. I can now click it a few times to make sure I get the full selection, and I'll go to Visual Studio Code and I'll remove all this stuff and just simply paste it here. Now I've changed the language here for JSON, and you can just simply put JSON or JSON with comments. And what I really want to do now is I want to make it a little pretty. So there is an extension here. It's called JSON Pretty Print, and you can install it from extension store for Visual Studio Code. And if you just simply execute it on the proper JSON, you'll see that your JSON is now beautified. So what we're seeing here is the request that the UI is sending down for processing on the backend. So we're starting off with the root schema name, the context, and that's if we are loosely trying to, well, if we're loosely mimicking SQL, that this is your from clause. So we're saying that we're going to be selecting something from a context, and this is the root schema name. This is the starting point for our entire request. Then UI is going to be very opinionated, and it's going to be sending a lot of requests that you may not need if you're integrating, for example, the backend to backend. So you don't need, for example, to provide operation type. It will be inferred from the URL that you are addressing. So here operation type 0 stands for select, but the backend is smart enough and it knows if you're sending it to the select query in the URL here in URL in the endpoint, then we don't really need this operation type because it is expected that you're going to be selecting things. All right, so we can probably remove this item. We don't quite need it. Include process execution data. We don't really need this stuff. All we need is we need data, so we don't really need to worry about business processes and all that stuff. So we're going to remove it. Let's also remove filters because we're not ready to discuss filters just yet. And we're going to leave columns for now, but let's review the other options that you have. Whether or not we're getting distinct records. So if you think that somehow through your request you might be getting duplicates, maybe you're joining something, then is distinct false or true is probably something that you want to play with. But for our purposes, when we're just querying the database, is distinct false, let it be. I know all my records are going to be unique. They're all by key, so that's okay. Row count and row offset. These are two properties that you can set to control how many things are coming back at you. So in this particular case, when the UI queries the backend, it queries only 30 records at the time. When it's going to send, let's imagine that your contact list is more than 30 records. So what's going to happen if you need 60 records? Well, you can change this number to 60. But what if you need 1,000 records? Well, you can change it to 1,000. What is the limit, you might ask? Well, it's 20,000 records. You cannot get more 20,000 records per one request, and you probably shouldn't be querying this amount of data. If you're querying that much data, you probably want to go to some other means, maybe go on a database level, maybe think of something else. But anyway, it's possible. So let's say that we want to ask for 10 requests. What if I have 60 records? Well, how do I ask for the second 10? Well, here's your row offset. So if you want the second 10, just say skip the first 10. If you want to skip the second 10, the first 20 records, just skip them. So now you're going to get everything from record 21 to 30. So you're going to get your third batch, etc. If you leave the number at 0, then obviously nothing gets skipped. And if you leave your row count at 0 or at -1, it's going to give you the maximum amount that it can give you. Now, there is also this option for pageable. Keep the pageable on if you want to use this row count and row offset. If you don't, you can remove all these lines. If the amount of data that you're querying is nowhere near 20,000, then you can just easily remove all these 3 lines. Whether or not to use all columns, it's probably a good idea not to use all columns. So we can remove that. By default, the value is false, as you could see. And whether or not use localization, that's an important one. We're going to talk in a minute about it. Now, use record deactivation. It's also important. And whether or not we should be using cached parameters for your SQL, for your ESQ. Now, if you're familiar with how to perform ESQ query, that shouldn't be anything new here, because that's exactly the same way that you're controlling the caching on the ESQ layer. But for the purposes of querying the data and just getting it from the external application or getting it from Creatio and putting it into your external application, it is probably best to start off without any caching so you're not running into stale data issues. Query optimize, we don't need to optimize anything here, so we can remove this. Obviously, we don't want any metrics and we don't need to provide any sources here. Ignore display values. We'll take an example of what that actually means. And conditional and hierarchical values, since we're just simply querying the data, we don't quite need to provide that stuff. It's a little bit more advanced for the purpose of this talk, so I'm going to leave that for self-study for you. Okay, so we've got some basic options, and let's go ahead and actually remove these lines as well. So our request is getting very, very short. You could see it's only 145 lines. I mean, it's still quite long, but it's not as long as what we've started off with. Now let's review what's inside columns. Inside columns, you will see that when the UI is asking for something, and you see all these columns that it's asking for, you might be wondering, where is the list coming from? And the list is simply coming from the list of columns that you have here on the UI layer. So here I've asked for contact name, account, job title, email, modified on, created on, and there might be some additional columns like phone and mobile phone because it's programmed in such a way. So this is where it's coming from. So the idea here is that if you add something here, the UI, our UI will build you the request and include the column that you're looking for. So for example, if I were to remove this entry point, and this is something that you're going to have to do pretty much for every request that you're copying from the UI, just nuke it. It doesn't, it's not going to help you. But if I were to create a new request now here, for example, I'm going to go to view and say select fields to display, I can add some additional columns. For example, I can swap created on with some other column from, let's do something fancy. Let's go to contact, let's go to from contact to account, and from account we can go down to maybe country, and then country will have a property called name. All right, so that's what we're going to do. And we're probably not going to have many names here, but at least some accounts will have it. So if I were to save this, and if I were to click F12 now and apply this, let's clear this up a little bit, and let's apply this request one more time. Let's grab the select query, and let's take a look at the source generated by the system. And what we want to do is make sure that when you go all the way down, at some point the browsers will start hiding things from you. So you got to make sure that you show all, otherwise you're not going to get the full text of the response or the request. Double click or triple click on this to make sure everything is selected. And let's go and put it back into Visual Studio. I'm going to put it in the split window here so we can just we can see some differences here, and I'm going to apply pretty print on it so we can compare how it changed. Also, don't forget to put the JSON if you want a colorized output or colorized input. Okay, perfect. So what we want to look at is how the columns have changed. So let's go and scroll all the way down to find the column that we've added, and you could see that the system has added, or the UI has built me an expression to get account country.name, and that's exactly the same thing that we already know how to do, because I told you that we can do the dot notation here, and there's my column path. Now, for simple things like this, you may not need the help of the UI to build this stuff for you, but for some advanced features that we will cover in the future, or we will cover in a little bit, you may want to refer to the help of the UI to actually build this for you. Okay, so let's go back to our first request, and we can see that when the UI is building it, it's also asking for a specific structure. It needs to represent the response, but when you're doing it yourself and when you are querying the data for your own consumption, you don't need many of these options. Namely, you don't need caption, order direction, order position, and whether or not it's visible. If you delete them, then they're going to be just taken on the default value. So let's just go and delete some of these requests. Now I'm not going to be deleting everything one by one, so let me just go back to Postman because I already have this request prepared for us. And let's put it back into Visual Studio so we can see what it looks like. Okay, so our request looks like this. All we have to leave is the expression. Inside the expression goes the expression type that specifies that it's the entity expression and the column path. And you can compare it to how verbose the UI is compared to what's the minimum requirement in order for you to get your data. I can also get rid of these values, and I didn't, but you can also get rid of these 3 lines. So now you can see that your request is a little bit shorter. It's only 43 lines compared to what we started off with. Now you might be wondering what's going to happen if the column that you are requesting doesn't exist. It's a good question. Let's take a look. Let's mimic that mistake. So here we have account city name, and instead of addressing it as a contact.account.city.name, let's address it with something that does not exist, namely name1. Name1 should not exist. Let's copy this and let's go to Postman and see if Postman can execute the request. So we're going to copy and paste into Postman. You could see that I'm about to send it with name1, and surprisingly, we're getting a response, even though we clearly have misstated the column path. But let's take a look at what's hidden in the response. What you will see is that there is not found column, and this is an array. So you can have multiple, or you can have many columns that are not found. And how are they identified? They are identified by the property in this JSON. So if this is account city name, then here you will find account city name not found. So you have to go here, find the path, and say, oh yeah, account.city.name truly does not exist, so maybe it's name2. And then make your fix and fix the problem. If you resend the request, then obviously you're going to get account city name. Now also here, a good example of what we're getting and how many rows we're collecting in return is provided in the property rows affected, 179. So if I were to put row count to, for example, 10, you'd see that I am only affecting 10 rows. And here's the answer of how many rows I'm requesting. So let's do this. Let's say that we're only asking for one row at a time, and here's one row. Thank you for the update. And let's do the row offset. Let's say that we're now asking for second row. So here we have the contact of Valerie E. Murphy. And now if we're asking for a second account, we're getting Sharon McCartney. Perfect, and so forth. And that works for one, and that works for a batch of 10 or 50 or 20,000. That's how you can query millions of records from the database. Okay, so that's all great, but at some point, you're probably going to say, well, I don't want the entire list of contacts. I need some contacts. I only need contacts that match a particular requirement. So you want to do filters. Just like in SQL, you say select something from somewhere, and now you want to add that where clause and specify that the account has to match certain criteria. So let's go back into our UI for help, and let's activate this filter. Now you should know how to do that. Just simply go into any list that you're interested in querying and say that you want to go to the advanced mode. So switch to the advanced mode and build your filters here. In this case, I'm going to build or start with a very simple filter where email equals my email. There's only one account here, or one contact that matches that, and that's my own contact. I've added that before this session, and there it is. So I expect my data service to also return me just one contact once I correctly configure it. So let's take a look at the request that's being generated by the UI in order to get just one contact. We're going to do the same thing again. We're going to clear the entire stack here, and we're going to click on the contact one more time. You can click on the contact, or you can click on apply. In this case, it really doesn't matter. It's going to do the same thing. Let's go into select query. Let's scroll all the way down, and we know what to do here. Click on the view source, and from the view source, make sure that we are not suppressing anything. And let's get the entire source. Let's copy it, and let's go back into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to put it on this side. And the reason I'm going to put it on the side is because I don't want to be redoing the side that we already have. I only want to redo the filters part. So let's prettify it. Let's do a pretty print on it. And we're not really interested in the columns, so we can suppress them. But we're interested in this property. We're interested in filters. And you could see that the structure is somewhat complex, and hopefully it will become a little bit more apparent why it is so complex later on. And if you work with the entity schema query and you try to build those complex queries where you do ands and ors and you enclose them in parentheses, this might look familiar to you and it might actually make sense. But for some of you who are new, this might look a little bit daunting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to simply grab this whole filter thing, the whole filter part, the property, and I'm going to paste it immediately after, well, let's say immediately after columns. So let's go here and let's paste our filters right here, and we should be good to go. Let's review it before we send it, or let's send it and then review it. Let's go back to Postman, and in Postman, if we paste the text of our request, we should see that we're only getting one record. So we are getting somewhere. So we are now filtering the records. We're now learning how to filter the records. Let's review our request. Inside our filters, we see that we have a filter. Inside the filter, there is an item. Inside the filter, there is an item. And inside that item, there is some unknown item. And then there is a custom filter. And eventually, you're going to get to this. You're going to get to items. And inside this items, you will have this expression. This is the meat and potato of your filter. Everything else is kind of the overhead. The reason we have this overhead is because when UI builds the filters, it has multiple filter options. So you can have those folder filters, you can have quick filters, you can have section filter, data view filters. So in order to encapsulate them all into one request, we need this complex structure. When you're building your own filters, you don't need that structure. So you might as well just go with this items. You may have taken this items component and just simply pasted that instead of this items component and basically moved it few layers up. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let you entertain yourself with this task. But what I want to do is I want to talk through how we're actually building the filter. So when you build a filter, we are saying that it's a filter type 1 and a comparison type 3. Now, these are very important properties. Now, how would you know that it's a filter type 1 and what does it mean? Well, filter type 1 stands for comparison filter. Now, there are a bunch of other filters and I will later show you where you can find those enums. Or you can go online on academy.creatio.com and find the article on data service and actually explain what those enums are and which classes inside the core, where they're defined. And I'm going to hopefully point you to in that direction today. But filter type 1 stands for comparison. So we're comparing A and B on left-hand side of the equation to the right-hand side of the equation. Hence the name, left expression, right expression. So now we know that we're comparing something on the left to something on the right. Now the comparison type 3 stands for equals. Now we could have expressed it maybe in a different way. We could have expressed it as an equal operation, or we could have said something other than number 3, but we chose to go with the integers to represent these operations. So it's 3, and there are many operations. There are things like greater than, not greater, exist, not exist, etc. So all your operations, everything that you can do in ESQ, in Entity Schema Query, you can do here with the data service as well. So whether or not it's enabled, well, that's self-explanatory. Of course, it's enabled. And trim data type parameter, that's when you start working with data, you may want to play with these properties. We're not going to be able to look at all the properties in the details now, but some of them you can delete. Namely, for this particular filter, you can delete these properties. All right, so let's go back into our Postman and see what will happen if I, for example, change this to some different email. So if I'm going to, by mistake, or not by mistake, but intentionally write a different email, will it still work? So you could see that the rows comes back as an empty array, meaning that no records were found. You're still getting a 200, so you know your request is correct, because if your request were incorrect, let's say you omitted a comma somewhere and you were to send it, you would get, interesting, well, in this particular case, that didn't affect the request, but in any event, you are going to get a more descriptive error if something is actually wrong. Well, in this case, you're not getting anything because there's no contact with 1. All right, so let's say it's Creatio.com. Perfect. Now, let's go and take a look at the request and how the request can be structured if my filter is a little bit more complex. Well, what I mean by a little bit more complex filter? Well, imagine that this part is not just simple email. What if this part contained multiple filters, and you can build them, and hopefully you know how to build them. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this. I am looking for contact, and contact has another related entity to it, and it's called communication options. So contact, contact communication option by column contact. So essentially there is a table called communication option that could be joined to a contact. And in here, if I want to find all the records related to contact communication option, that's where we store additional phones and emails and Skypes and Facebooks and whatever other communication option you have in the contact, that's where it's stored. So how do I go and how do I find them? Well, you first have to go to quantity, and then in the quantity you say that it has to exist. And once you say that it exists, then you can express the filter condition. You click on a plus, you note that now you're working with the contact communication option table, and in here there is a property called number, and this is where the email would be stored. So for example, I'm going to grab this email and I'm going to say that the number has to equal this thing. So now my filter is clearly more complicated. Let me apply this and let me grab the latest select query and do the same thing we always do. We're going to go to view source. We're going to go to show more and just grab the whole thing. Copy it over and let's post it in Visual Studio into, which one is this? Into here perhaps. All right, let's make it pretty and let's review the filter that was built for us. Well, somewhere here you will see that you have this custom filter, and what we're doing now, everything that we're doing is actually sitting inside the custom filter. So this ID that's being built, that's randomly generated ID, and you can replace it with your own values. It doesn't have to be A, C, E, E, F, 0, A5. It can be any string you want, and it doesn't even have to be of a particular length. So you can replace it with something more sensible. So what you would want to do when you're building your integration is you probably want to identify these filters so they're easier to find. So in this case, what I would probably do is I would probably say that I am looking for contact by email, right? Because that's what we're querying. So here, filter by primary email. And I'm just going to rename it like this. Okay, so what did I do wrong? I forgot double quotes. Okay, and this filter, well, this filter has to do with filter by contact communication options, right? So that's where we're looking for additional properties describing that particular contact. So to build this filter, you could see that the filter type is now 5 because the first thing we have to say is that it exists in a subset, and then we have to build the subset, what we call subfilters. So first we're expressing that the communication option joined in the contact by column ID has to exist, and that's what 5 and 15 stands for. And then the subfilter will express that the number has to match this literal, so Kirill Krylov. Now, if you're thinking about building it by hand, there's quite a lot of strings or quite a lot of properties that you have to get right. But at the end of the day, the only thing that you care to change in your code, if this is what you wanted to do, is this: email, change to the value. So the email actually you probably wouldn't change, but you would change a string here and you would pass a variable here. That's it. 2 things to change and your entire request is completed. Go into your favorite program or your programming language and just simply do a web request. Send it to the system, include Bpmcsrf, and get the response. So let's see what happens if I were to send this request down to the server. We're going to go back to Postman for that. And actually, I made a mistake. I should probably, where's my, let me just grab the filter property. I don't want to be changing the rest. Just this guy. And I'm going to get rid of this filter. And I'm going to paste this filter. Okay, and I'm going to take this request and I'm going to send it to the Postman. All right. Let's send this. Okay, so I'm seeing that it's still curl, it's still the same contact who's coming back, but hopefully at this point, the idea is kind of sinking in. You've got the UI that we're using for kind of a ad hoc query builder for us. So when we are learning about data service, it is going to be a fantastic tool for us to start off with. Okay, so let's take a look at what else we can use the UI for to benefit our development. Well, I showed you before that you can add columns, and let me temporarily close this, and let me temporarily shrink this a little. Actually, I might close this altogether. And what I want to do is I want to include something a little bit more complex here. So for example, let's go to select fields to display, and let's try to pull something that would be difficult to express by hand. So for example, contacts usually have activities, activity, and I want to activity by contact or by owner, so different ways to get there, but let's say we're going to go by owner. And in the activity, there is probably something that we want to find. So let's look for activity for duration. So here's a duration in minutes, and that's what we want to get back. So we're going to call it just duration, or we can accept this particular one, and we get to choose the function. So the amount stands for sum, the maximum stands for maximum, the minimum, minimum, and average, obviously average. But look at this, you have another way of filtering things. So in here, I can express more filters. So for example, activity duration, I am only interested in minutes that perhaps exceeds, let's say exceeds 30 minutes. So let's find out if there are any, or let's see it for every contact. And we could see that Valerie E. Murphy has 840 total counts of minutes where those conditions are satisfied. So let's save this, and let's get rid of this filter for just a quick second, and let's apply it. So let's see what happens. So 840 and 180, and so let's see if we can duplicate this request. If we're going to go back to F12, and we're going to click on the contact, and let's take a look at how the query is built. Now we're going to do the same thing we always do. Just go to the source and make sure that nothing is suppressed, and show more, and show more. They're resilient. Okay, and now let's select the whole thing, and let's first go in Visual Studio and parse it and make it a little bit prettier, because we're particularly interested in one column. Let's go pretty print, and let's go look for that column, and that's probably this long one. Let's go home, and there's the column that we have requested. And look, it sits in your columns property, and that's exactly the name that the system gave us automatically. And here's my join on the column path, so activity on owner, duration in minutes. And if you don't know what this expression is, just go and read a little bit about entity schema query building column path. That will be very helpful to understand what this means. And then inside this, inside the select, inside the columns properties, we get the sub filter that allows us to further refine what kind of properties we're asking for. So if I were to copy this and add it to my request, I would get this fairly complex query built in a matter of minutes. So I can go back now to my Postman, find my array of properties, wherever they are, and I can put it anywhere I want. I can put it before ID, doesn't matter. But let me put it right after my account. I'm going to put it right here, and I can send this thing. And object reference not set to an instance of an object. Look, I must have typed something incorrectly. Maybe I don't need this guy. So let's see if this comes back, and this comes back properly. Now, what I do see is that I do not have any activities that match those requirements. So I don't have anything that exceeds 30 minutes in duration, and then thus there's nothing for me to sum. So this is how you would build your requests, and this is how you would create them with the UI. So at this point, let me take some questions that people might have right now. Let me see if I have anything. Okay, just reading some questions. Just give me a second. Okay, so Mike is asking if there is documentation available to use OAuth 2.0 authentication flow. And at this point, at the point of the release, there is no documentation available yet. It's probably going to be released within the next week or so. So please stay tuned and just check the Academy frequently. You will be able to see how you set up your own tokens, how you set up your keys. And in terms of consumption, it's the same thing as what we've seen today, how you log into the how we've logged in with Postman. It's now, instead of logging in with username and password, you're logging in with the keys and the secrets. Okay. John is asking how long the Bpmcsrf cookie stays alive. Okay, so that's a great question. The Bpmcsrf cookie, and actually all of the cookies, they will expire, and that's the property that is set in the system. So if you go into system setting and take a look at the amount of time that you're allowed to not have any requests, you can take a look at that property in the main settings. Let me go and find one. So there are a couple of places where we can check it. So the first one, you can go under the cogwheel here. And if we go into users, system users, and let's take B. Murphy, for example. It doesn't matter who we take. You can see that under access rules, I believe, there is a user session timeout, and you can specify it on per user basis. The maximum value is 720, which is 12 hours. Or you can find this setting in the system settings that will be applied company-wide. All right. All right, well, I'm not seeing many other questions that people are interested in, and that's probably because we need to make sure that you actually grab this value, grab this code and understand it. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer them. Maybe not today, but in the next couple of days, I'll certainly get to it, and I will be able to answer all your questions. So at this point, I think we can wrap up. So thank you very much for being with me today. Let me just double check that I don't have anything more. Yep. So thank you very much for being with me today, and I'll see you next time in the next track. Goodbye.